Well, welcome everybody. My name is Lori Cohen. I am the founder and executive director of the Beagle Alliance. We have been doing these free virtual town halls now since we began in the middle of 2022. And really, it's been a great way to connect with the community and, of course, get information out there about a variety of subjects regarding animals. However, the majority is surrounding animals in research, of course, which is our mission and passion to place former research dogs specifically into loving homes. So tonight's pretty timely and a pretty special, I mean, honestly, they're all special town halls, and we're very grateful for our guests all the time, of course, but this is very timely. Ridglan Farms has been around for a very long time. Of course, they are the second largest breeder. In fact, their website says the exact words, purpose-bred beagles for my biomedical research. And so today we're going to get a rundown, sort of start to finish, and of course not finish, because we hope there's going to be lots of meaningful endings to all of this. But today, welcome Amy Van Aartsen, the executive director and co-founder of the Marty Project, and Lindsey Soffes, who does lead programs for Rise for Animals and has a background in law and nonprofit advocacy, and really is a part of the investigations. So these two have really been spearheading a lot of what's been going on with Ridglan Farms and what's happening with some of the exposés and the information that we've seen throughout in the media. So I'm going to be quiet now and have them both chat and do a presentation. And of course, we'll do question and answer after. So welcome, you guys. Thank you so much for being here. I know how busy you are.
Thank you, Lori, so much for having us. We're so excited to be here, and thank you to everyone who's joining us. Amy and I are very excited to have this discussion and to share with you some of what we've been working on, and then to get your thoughts and questions and hopefully help spur ideas for what we can do together. This is, of course, a community effort. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen here, and then we will get started.
Perfect.
Okay. Can everybody see Ridglan Farms? Amy, can you see the head slide? Okay, perfect. Well, welcome everybody. To get started, and Lori, thank you for that introduction. We just want to take a moment to orient you to who we are and the perspective that we're bringing to this conversation. So I'm Lindsey Soffes. I'm head of programs at Rise for Animals. Rise for Animals is a national animal rights organization working to end animal experimentation once and for all. Every year, as many of you know, untold millions of animals are used as research tools in laboratories, and not even because science requires it, but because our political and economic systems not only allow, but actually reward their exploitation. And we believe that has to change. At Rise, our work is to pull back the curtain on the machinery that keeps the system going, the players, the regulatory gaps, the money, and the pervasive misinformation that shields it from public view. To that end, we investigate, we expose, and we publish records that the industry hopes you'll never see. We mobilize people to take action, and we push for structural change that frees animals from labs and invests in science that is ethical, human relevant, and grounded in justice. Ultimately, we're not fighting for better regulation of animal research. We're working to end it, because we reject the idea that some lives exist for others to use, and because we believe in building a world rooted in rights, equality, and liberation for all, regardless of species. I'm thrilled to share this space with you today, and I'm looking forward to diving in to what this system looks like, why it persists, and how together we can help dismantle it. Over to you, Amy.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsey. Well, hi, everybody. It's really great to be here. And Lori, thanks especially for the invitation to join you all this evening for the town hall. So my name is Amy Van Aartsen, and I serve as the executive director of the Marty Project. So our mission is to establish public policy that promotes the replacement of dogs that are used in human product safety testing with evidence-based scientific alternatives. So in short, we work to connect people, science, and policy for the love of dogs. And our organization is actually named after my co-founder's former beagle, Marty, who was born at Ridglan Farms and then endured 5 years of drug testing out in Colorado. At the age of 6, Marty was one of the lucky ones who was released to a rescue organization, one of our rescue partners, actually Kindness Ranch Animal Sanctuary. And there he was adopted by my co-founder. So by centering Marty's story, it reminds us that the Marty Project is more than a mission. It's a promise to dogs that we will do everything we can to elevate and expedite full implementation of non-animal methods to end dog experimentation. So while the Marty Project as an organization just launched about a year ago, I actually first became involved in the movement kind of regarding Ridglan Farms about 4 years ago when I first learned about the issue of dog experimentation. I was completely horrified this was happening in my own backyard. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, which is just minutes from Ridglan Farms. So for years, despite I regularly passed the exit for the facility, and I even used to bike out on country roads in high school and college near the facility, I didn't have any idea that this was happening. So as soon as I heard about what was happening, though, I do feel really grateful that I was able to find a truly outstanding community right here in Madison with folks who are already kind of working on this issue to free the dogs from the facility. So then when the opportunity presented itself about a year ago, I co-founded the Marty Project, and that's really allowed me to leverage my personal background in science and public health. So to really kind of focus more on those upstream prevention efforts to end dog experimentation as a whole. So right now we're just a volunteer-based organization. We're primarily out of Madison, Wisconsin. And then I actually work full-time at the university as a researcher. I think we might have somebody off mute. Do you want to help us there, Lori?
Yep.
Awesome. So yeah, so really enjoying kind of doing this as a volunteer operation, and excited to see as we keep growing kind of how we can kind of grow and change. And I'm grateful to be here with you all tonight and to be presenting with Lindsey. So thanks, everybody. We will jump into our next slide then. So what is Ridglan Farms? Before we jump into details about the regulatory landscape and just how our two organizations came together, we did want to provide a high-level overview of the facility we're going to be talking about tonight. So like I mentioned, Ridglan Farms is located just outside of Madison, Wisconsin, in a rural community of Blue Mounds. It's a pretty small community. And on this slide here, you can actually see an aerial photo of the facility, and it's just barely visible from the public road. It blends right in, you really can't see it. But here you can see where the dogs are actually housed in these really long sheds or windowless. And Ridglan Farms has been operating since 1966, really kind of largely under the radar. And they first came into business after the US government put out a call for the creation of dog breeding research facilities. And then over years, it's unfortunately become the second largest supplier of beagles for researchers in the entire United States. So Ridglan Farms is licensed both as a breeding and a research facility, which we'll get into a little bit. And it has then kind of resulted in the horrific pipeline of tens of thousands of dogs per year being sold to other laboratories or being experimented on site. So disturbingly, this facility is run by a veterinarian and co-owned by other veterinarians as well. So for decades, between about 2,000 and 3,200 beagles were recorded as being part of its breeding operation at any one time. So most of these dogs are housed in stacked cages with hard graded flooring inside windowless sheds. They're kept there 24/7, 365 days a year. These dogs don't even get to go outside. It's really sad. So I think this description alone paints a really startling picture, but there's another detail that kind of really brings the conditions into focus. Just recently, the facility was boasting that they had increased their staffing to be able to provide each dog with 1 minute of socialization per day. Just 1 minute for a highly social, energetic breed like a beagle. And I will say my beagle is here too, and she's currently being quiet, and we'll see how long it lasts. Normally this is our park hours, so I think we'll be okay, but she's very energetic, and it just breaks my heart that these dogs only just amongst everything, only get a minute of socialization per day. So up until more recently, Ridglan has been able to go largely unnoticed, but the facility has been under scrutiny for quite a long time, largely by animal rights organizations. But there was a big shift in the past year as there was finally traction with regulators and the courts to act in response to documentation and evidence at the facility. So we'll get into details shortly, but after a recent criminal investigation, the breeding side of the facility is finally going to come to an end. So beginning in July 2026, in lieu of criminal charges, Ridglan has agreed to surrender their state-issued commercial breeding license. This agreement unfortunately won't end the research that happens on site at the facility, but it does mark a major turning point as Ridglan will no longer be allowed to sell dogs for research, which is what the majority of the dogs were used for.
Thanks, Amy, for that background. And before we proceed, we're going to talk briefly about the regulatory landscape. We're going to try to look at not only what is going on in the United States, and then comparing that a bit to Canadian regulations, because it's awesome to be speaking to kind of an international audience. So bear with me, some of this is technical. We'll welcome any questions. And we're just trying to give you a broad overview, so please forgive, it's going to be pretty quick and high level, but important to understanding the advocacy strategy that the groups in the US have taken, and then also understanding what this could look like in Canada. So in the US, animal research oversight is really built on this quasi-centralized legislative system within the federal government's domain. States don't regulate animal research really, though they may have regulations that affect certain actors in the animal research enterprise, like dog breeders, as we'll see with Ridglan. Federally, the US has two primary regulatory pillars. One, the Animal Welfare Act. This is the only federal law that addresses animal research, which is administered by the US Department of Agriculture. And secondly, the Public Health Service Policy, not a law, which implements the Health Research Extension Act, is administered by the National Institutes of Health, and applies only to some labs, which we'll discuss. Because Canada lacks a federal law addressing animals in research, and in fact is one of the only industrialized nations without a law, it may seem like the US framework is very robust, but not so much in practice. For example, the Animal Welfare Act defines animal, and therefore the federal law's scope, to exclude more than 99% of the animals used in research, so 99 out of 100. It excludes mice, rats, and birds bred for research. It excludes invertebrates. It excludes cold-blooded animals. It excludes farmed animals used for agricultural research. And this means that the US federal oversight scheme applies to fewer than 1% of all animals victimized for science in the United States. The Public Health Service Policy, by contrast, applies to more animals. It includes all vertebrates, so that it also includes mice, rats, birds, fish, etc. But it doesn't have the force of law. Rather, it's contractual, and it applies only to those labs receiving funding from the federal government. This is somewhat similar to the Canadian setup, which we'll discuss in just a bit. It's also important to understand when considering the US arena that neither US law nor policy prohibits a single harm to a single animal. Researchers can do anything as long as they offer a quote-unquote scientific justification. For purposes of Ridglan, it is important to understand that labs that are subject to the Animal Welfare Act, so to the federal law, meaning labs that are using animals covered by the act, like dogs, must hold a Class R registration that's issued by the USDA. These labs have to submit annual reports to the government and allow for government inspections, but they are not subject to any real enforcement of the law. Most fundamentally, the USDA does not have the authority to revoke a Class R registration. It's just not built into the law, which means that the government can't actually stop a lab even when it's operating illegally. And honestly, it can't even penalize them really as of 2024, when a Supreme Court decision was interpreted to invalidate the USDA's ability to level monetary fines for animal welfare violations. These fines really comprise the fulcrum of the enforcement mechanism. Today, we see a USDA that doesn't even really purport to do more than issue an occasional warning to a laboratory found to not comply with law. And the USDA itself doesn't even consider these warnings to constitute enforcement actions. Outside of animal research, but closely related in some cases, like in Ridglan's, the Animal Welfare Act requires that entities breeding and dealing in animals for research hold either a Class A or Class B license. And importantly, unlike research registrations, the USDA does have the explicit authority to suspend, terminate, or revoke these licenses, though of course it almost never has or does. So as we've just touched on, Canada doesn't have a federal law that purports to regulate the use of animals in research. Instead, Canada relies on what's essentially a social contract or a voluntary guideline-driven model under the purview of a private entity that was formed to support universities and government departments doing animal research, and that the Canadian nonprofit Animal Justice has described as being dominated by animal experimenters. This agency or organization is the Canadian Council on Animal Care, or the CCAC. The CCAC sets national standards, it develops guidelines and policies on animal care and use, and it operates a certification program. But only labs that receive federal research funding are required to participate. And this is very similar to the public health service policy in the US, which we touched on, and it applies only to federally funded labs. So very similarly, a scope out of all of the labs operating, we're talking about those receiving certain funding. Canadian labs not receiving federal research funding are not subject to federal oversight or standards. And this does mirror what we see in the United States, where labs that are using animals not covered by the Animal Welfare Act and not receiving federal funding also fly under the radar. The CCAC's guidelines cover all vertebrates, animals, and cephalopods used in research. So in practice, this means that animals not even considered animals, quote unquote, in the US, including mice, rats, and birds bred for research, are considered in Canada. But unfortunately, the CCAC's guidelines don't have the force of law. Their strongest sanction is recommending that to the government that it withdraw grant funding. Though Animal Justice has reported that there's no publicly available information to suggest that funding has ever been stopped due to noncompliance. Because Canada has no federal law, provinces can fill in the gaps. And here we'll raise just a few points of note. So first, all provinces have general animal protection acts that technically apply to animals in labs, though they have not been used to prosecute animal researchers, because it seems that in practice, if a lab is following CCAC approved protocols, it is considered to be within generally accepted practices and thus shielded from cruelty charges. This outcome is similar to that in the United States, where state animal cruelty laws tend to explicitly exempt research activities, and where courts have actually ruled that anti-cruelty statutes don't apply when research is being conducted pursuant to a federal program. So again, an area of overlap here in kind of the effect of regulation. 6 provinces in Canada have legislation or regulations relating specifically to animal research taking effect or taking place within their province, and most of them explicitly reference CCAC standards. And then of them, 1 province, Ontario, specifically addresses research animals with a specific law, the Animals for Research Act, or ARA. And this enables the inspectorate to control the registration of research facilities and the licensing of supply facilities. And this we'll talk about in a moment is kind of analogous to what we're seeing on the federal level in the United States, except it's specific to the province of Ontario. Overall, Canada's patchwork system means that Canadian researchers and other actors can face dramatically different rules depending on where they are. And this is something that US researchers and related actors subject to a more nationally uniform system don't face in the US. Neither the US nor Canada publishes complete statistics on animal use, so we don't know how many animals are either used in research or bred for research. With regard to the research itself, there are at least some reporting requirements to the government in the United States and to the CCAC in Canada, which gives us some data to work with. But with regard to breeders for research, we're often left largely in the dark. In the US, labs report well over 1 million animals annually, Though it has been estimated that were labs to have to report mice, rats, and birds bred for research, that number would exceed 100 million. And that wouldn't even account for other excluded animals, including the cold-blooded, the invertebrate, and some of the farmed. In 2024, US labs reported using 42,600-ish dogs. And of those labs that use dogs, just as a side note, Ridglan was among the top 10 highest users in the United States. The most recent numbers I've seen for Canada come from 2023, when the CCAC reported more than 3.1 million animals, including over 16,100 dogs. Again, though, this number includes more species than the US, but accounts only for those labs receiving federal funding or voluntarily reporting their numbers to the organization. So bottom line, what we see is that in both countries, total animal counts are incomplete, and true national numbers are far higher than reported. In fact, when we look at the four figures that we have laid out on this slide, we really only have confidence in the US dog total, because at least on paper, US labs are being required to report their specific numbers to the government every year. Worldwide, these numbers have led Cruelty Free International to estimate that both the United States and Canada are among the 5 largest users of animals, and specifically dogs, for research. Both countries use dogs mainly in regulatory testing, like toxicity testing, but also in some biomedical research. And this brings us to a question most important when it comes to Ridgland. Where are the dogs coming from? In the United States, almost all dogs used in labs are purpose-bred, as Lori referenced at the beginning, by government licensed facilities like Marshall Farms and Ridglan Farms. Canada, however, still has, from what I've found, 2 significant streams of supply: purpose-bred and shelters or homes. Canadian data has historically shown lots of dogs entering labs from shelters or as quote-unquote donations directly from their guardians. And this is different than the United States, where labs rarely use what they would term as quote-unquote random source, so the opposite of purpose-bred dogs. They used to, more significantly, but long-term and targeted advocacy has led to significant reductions in the number of dogs entering labs from shelters. And in fact, many US states today have outlawed the practice. But this raises an important point, because Canada does rely heavily on purpose-bred dogs, and because Canada is not home to large commercial breeders of dogs like those in the United States, Canada's use of dogs strongly links our 2 countries' animal research programs. Canada imports large numbers of its quote-unquote research dogs from the United States, including, we understand, from Ridglan Farms.
Thanks, Lindsey. So that brings us back to Ridglan Farms, and we're going to talk about Ridglan as a case study. And so kind of jumping into that, I think, Lindsey, is there a different, I don't think there's a slide I was envisioning. There we go, thanks, okay. So it's been a long journey so far in terms of kind of the timeline. So before we jump into the work that Lindsey and I have done together through our organizations, we did want to give a nod to the reason I became involved, and perhaps the reason many of you actually kind of first heard about Ridglan Farms, was an open rescue that was done back in 2017. So in 2017, 3 activists went into the facility as part of an open rescue operation, and they rescued 3 beagles, Julie, Anna, and Lucy. But then subsequently, 5 years later, in 2023, those activists were actually then prosecuted. Linz, can you advance the slide for me? One more time, thanks. So, back one. Thanks. So here we've got a photo of actually the open rescue that was in 2017. So here's actually Paul with, I think, Julie in the facility. And then we also see a photo of Wayne with one of the pups too, after they were rescued. So back in 2017, these activists entered the facility to do what's called open rescue. And this is typically a strategy that's used when there's no other perceived option, and to get evidence into court about animal cruelty or mistreatment that's happening behind closed doors. So while Ridglan has recently released their own video footage of the facility, actually the majority of photos and videos that have been publicly shared about the facility came about from the open rescue. So after the open rescue was completed, the activists then brought forth this evidence that was acquired during that process to the Dane County District Attorney. They asked him to prosecute Ridglan Farms for criminal animal cruelty. Instead of prosecuting Ridglan Farms, unfortunately, the state turned around and filed charges against the three activists, so Wayne, Eva, and Paul. And then after public outcry, resulting in a lot of unwanted attention on Ridglan Farms, the prosecutor then actually dismissed the case against the activists at the request of the facility. But this evidence really was accumulated and then resulted in the ability to turn around and file a petition for the special prosecutor in March of 2024. So in a very creative maneuver to get evidence into court, an uncommonly used legal mechanism was leveraged. So a coalition of some organizations, including Dane for Dogs, Alliance for Animals, and Wayne Shung, petitioned the court for a special prosecutor. And so, in short, this petition was based on the fact that the district attorney for Ridglan's district had failed to respond to hundreds of emails and requests for the facility to be investigated for years. A special prosecutor was then appointed after a judge found probable cause that Ridglan Farms had violated Wisconsin's animal cruelty statutes. Evidence that was presented included some pretty horrific findings, surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, or that they were improperly delegated to non-veterinarians, dogs kept in inhumane housing, and the evidence of systemic neglect. So actually just last month, in lieu of facing criminal charges, Ridglan agreed to surrender their state-issued commercial dog breeder license by July 1st of 2026. This was a really pivotal moment just in terms of kind of the overall landscape of Ridglan Farms. And then in December of 2024, a veterinary examining board complaint was filed. So while we were waiting for the judge to make a decision about whether or not to appoint a special prosecutor, another nonprofit organization, Dane for Dogs, filed a complaint with the Wisconsin Veterinary Examining Board against two veterinarians at the facility. The complaint alleged that they repeated and had systemic violations of Wisconsin's Code of Veterinary Ethics and the Wisconsin's criminal animal cruelty laws. One particularly salient allegation was that cherry eye surgeries were improperly performed without anesthesia or veterinary supervision, which is simply when a prolapsed Nicotin's gland in the eye, it's commonly described as a third eyelid, is removed. Notably, the Wisconsin Veterinary Examining Board has stated that the technique that Ridglan has used historically to remove the entire gland, even if done properly, has been considered flagrant malpractice since 1991. So this complaint has resulted in 8 known or current former Ridglan employees having had cases opened by the VEB. So currently, the lead veterinarian remains suspended as the investigation continues. And actually just today, there was a meeting, the veterinarian petitioned to have the suspension uplifted. And then an administrative law judge and the VEB upheld the decision to keep his license suspended. So to date, 2 of these cases have been dismissed, but 5 do remain open against the former current employees of the facility. And so this complaint also resulted in the Veterinary Examining Board finding 308 violations related to surgeries done improperly. These violations then were referred over to the entity that regulates their state license at the facility level, DATCAF, Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. This resulted in a civil forfeiture violation, and then the special prosecutor did subsequently address that in his agreement with Ridglan to shut down the breeding operation.
With all of the action at the state level, in April, Rise for Animals and the Marty Project filed our first joint federal complaint seeking to get the feds involved. As we touched on earlier, Ridglan is subject to USDA oversight, both for its dog breeding, for which it holds a Class A license, and its animal research operations, for which it holds a Class R registration. Because states, as we talked about, can't regulate research, meaning that Ridglan's animal research is beyond the reach of Wisconsin agencies, we weren't surprised when Ridglan started trying to argue that all of its dogs are quote unquote research animals. Only that's not allowed. To our mind, by the applicable laws and regulations. Federally, Ridglan has to classify its dogs under either its Class A breeder dealer license or its Class R registration, and it has to do this for multiple purposes, including USDA inspection reports. And as the graph on the screen shows, Ridgeland has reported to the USDA significantly more dogs under its Class A breeding license than under its Class R research registration. And this directly undercuts its claims that it's made publicly that all of its dogs should be considered quote unquote research animals. At the state level, Ridgeland also classifies dogs for purposes of, as Amy said, DATCAP or State Department of Agriculture requirements, because that agency's authority extends only to dogs being bred, not dogs being used for research. So on the basis of Ridgeland's statements, we asked the USDA and DATCAP, the state agency, to investigate and to take appropriate action as warranted. Unfortunately, and exemplifying the facade that really is the federal US regulatory system, the USDA admitted to not really understanding its own regulations with regard to the classification of dogs, especially at institutions like Ridgeland that have multiple facets of their operation that are subject to different regulations. And the USDA basically said, we're not sure how Ridgeland should be classifying its dogs. We're not sure when a dog should be moved from a Class A license to the Class R registration or vice versa. And because of this, the USDA took no further action. To date, neither has DATCAP.
This next one is really interesting, I think. So in May, we submitted a Wisconsin ethics complaint after we obtained internal emails that revealed a longtime DATCAP employee, Connie Jarabek, sent an unsolicited email to the agency secretary, so the head of the agency, back in January, where she defended Ridglan Farms and then also attacked animal advocates. What Connie failed to mention in her email, though, is that she's actually the daughter of Jim Burns, who's one of the co-owners, and she previously worked at Ridgeland, which is just incredibly troubling that this was happening. With questions rising about why is a state regulator who has these personal ties to Ridgeland, she worked there herself, her father owns and runs Ridgeland, why would she be inserting herself into an active investigation without disclosing her massive conflict of interest? So DATCAP was ultimately assigned to investigate this complaint. This was back, in May, and so we unfortunately haven't heard anything yet, and Connie Jarabek continues to be employed at DATCAP, so we'll kind of curious to see what happens there.
Then in September, we filed a new USDA or federal complaint requesting federal involvement in light of DATCAP state level findings. So as Amy mentioned, DATCAP concluded that Ridgeland had committed at least 311 violations of state regulations. And the basis of our complaint was that the state level violations identified by DATCAP suggested similar federal violations could be at play. So for example, Ridgeland was found by the state to have violated the state regulation requiring daily body, mobility, and behavior checks for dogs. And federal regulations that undergird the Class A license Ridgeland holds require the daily assessment of dogs' health and well-being. These seem like analogous regulations, and it would seem reasonable that conduct violative of one could be conduct violative of the other. So we once again asked the USDA to investigate and take appropriate action. And we're still awaiting information on how the USDA has investigated and made determinations pursuant to this complaint.
That brings us to September. October. So following suspension of the lead veterinarian of the facility in September, October was a really big month for us. So Rise and the Marty Project approached Dane County Board of Supervisors about passing a resolution that would call on the state regulatory DATCAP to revoke Ridgeland's commercial breeding license. And then in October, we were incredibly pleased that the Dane County Board of Supervisors resolution passed with a vote of 30-5. While this resolution is not binding, we do believe it built a tremendous amount of political will and has been instrumental as we continue to work to hold Ridgeland accountable and advance full implementation of non-animal methods. Notably, the resolution declared that dogs are sentient beings that deserve care, respect, and the ethical treatment, and therefore, Dane County must ensure the legal treatment of animals such as these within its jurisdiction, and must hold both local and state agencies accountable for enforcing the law.
And to round out this this list of actions that we've taken or angles we've tried to pursue, we can say that most recently we filed complaints at the state level with DATCAP and the Veterinary Examining Board that Amy discussed earlier, that's looking into veterinary practices. And we asked both of these bodies to look further into certain of the filings that Ridgeland has made with the state. So when Ridgeland sells dogs to out-of-state buyers, it has to file forms with DATCAP that identify the dogs being sold. Earlier this year, Rise for Animals and the Marty Project were actually able to use these filings that we received from DATCAP through public records requests to identify most of Ridgeland's US customers. These records, just for purposes of the continuing conversation, are called certificates of veterinary inspection. And they basically require that a veterinarian sign off and say, these are the animals who are traveling interstate and they are fit to travel, they are healthy. One of our eagle-eyed allies analyzed all of the dogs' IDs that were listed on the CVIs we obtained, and he identified 2 separate filings that specified 17 of the same animal IDs, and we're showing 4 on the screen. So because these IDs are supposed to be unique to individual dogs, their recurrence suggests that Ridgeland sold the same 17 dogs twice. First to Alta Sciences, and then several months later to Charles River. Alternatively, this could suggest errors in the paperwork Ridgeland filed with the state, and on which Ridgeland suspended veterinarian, suspended in part for poor record keeping, signed off. We have asked the appropriate state agencies to look into this. And this brings us to another point about the CVI. So part of what was so interesting about these records is that it allows us to map several aspects of Ridgeland's business and primarily its business relationships. And this serves, we think, as a really critical reminder. And that is that any one actor in the animal research enterprise, in this case, Ridglan Farms, is just that, one actor. Each part of the industry and every player within it props up and is propped up by a larger network. We can never lose sight of this, we think, and we must remember that Ridgeland continues to operate because there is demand for what it does. There is lucrative demand for the harm that it causes. And the answer, we think, here is to advocate for a world where none of this is allowed, not at or by Ridgeland or anywhere or by anyone else.
So just to recap, where does everything stand with Ridgeland now? There's been a lot of updates here. We've talked about a lot of complaints we filed too. So one of the big ones is beginning in this upcoming July, Ridgeland will surrender their state-issued commercial breeding license. This was as a result of negotiation with the special prosecutor, and so instead of going to court, they agreed to give up their commercial breeding license. This is a big deal, just given that they have the majority of the dogs on their registration and licenses are for breeding purposes, and so about 2,000 currently, meaning that they can no longer sell dogs to other sites. Unfortunately, they still can continue operating as a research facility. Their most recent registration, I think, had 84 dogs on it, so the number is much smaller. It still is, really unfortunate they can continue to breed for dogs on site for research, not to sell. But this was still a big pivotal moment. Currently, the lead veterinarian and the facility manager, his veterinary license remains suspended while the investigation continues. We do expect to see a decision on that soon about kind of their full decision if they will revoke his license entirely or not. An additional 5 current or former employees do remain under investigation either by VEB or DATCAP, depending on their license or unlicensed status. Additionally, the USDA still has not gotten involved in response to state violations. And so we filed different complaints with them, and they continue to not get involved. So we do hope to see that change soon too. Additionally, these outstanding complaints, we'll see what happens there as well. And that kind of also brings us to zoom back out to what are the updates of the federal policy ecosystem at kind of the larger level. And so in recent months, several major federal agencies have taken meaningful steps towards reducing and ultimately phasing out dog testing and regulatory standards. So first, the Food and Drug Administration, which largely regulates new pharmaceuticals entering the market, they released a new roadmap that outlined how the agency plans to finally transition away from traditional animal testing and increase reliance on non-animal methods. So within 3 to 5 years, the agency, quote, seeks to make animal studies the exception rather than the norm for preclinical safety and toxicity testing. Additionally, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, which largely regulates chemicals and pesticides, they had previously committed to phasing out animal testing, but back in April, then the EPA essentially signaled a return to this trajectory of phasing out animal testing. And then lastly, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, they provide grant funding for academic research. They also set the research national priorities within the US. They announced that they will also prioritize human relevant methodologies, such as in vitro models and computational tools. So there's still a lot of progress to be made here. These announcements have been really critical and give hope that tangible change will soon be realized. And that brings us to the end. So we just want to thank you all for being here with us tonight. And we are saying, hopeful for the dogs, not only the animals. These are actually some photos of the pups that were rescued at Ridglan Farms back in 2017. And we are just hoping to kind of, keep the hope alive and keep things going with them. And would love to take questions from y'all now too. So thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you so much. That's just so much information and such amazing work. And wow, lots in October. We do have some questions, so I'll read them, but I want to just, I want to make a comment. I appreciate that you guys made a comparison from US to Canada. Interestingly enough, we did just get the 2024 statistics from the Canadian Council on Animal Care, and there was the use of dogs went down by about 6,000, but the use of animals went up by 500,000. Now, what is interesting in Canada in terms of transparency is that we're never sure what that means exactly, because in 2022, it was about 10,000 dogs. In 2024, it was reported 16,000. And then now it's gone to about 10,000 as well. And because it's a voluntary regulatory body, we don't know if there's really, if the use of dogs is going down or if the reporting has changed. Because of course, in Canada, you can have a laboratory in your backyard, nobody knows about it, and they don't have to report anywhere. And the Canadian Council on Animal Care also, seems to be exempt from a Freedom of Information Act. So we cannot really get information. So now what I want to ask you guys, because this is fascinating, is that I do believe that anybody who knows about animal research, animals in research, really in Canada does think that the United States has a higher bar for regulation. And it's now seeming a little bit like the USDA is really a packet, is kind of the gift wrap, and there's nothing to it. It looks like it's a law, but it's there to look pretty. Is that is that primarily what that is?
I think that's a great question, Lori. And I would say that is how it feels to those of us advocating around this issue. We certainly recognize the benefit of having federal regulations. What's interesting in looking at this is that I think both the setup in the United States and in Canada, it seems both stemmed from kind of community pressure, this public desire for regulation around animal research. And what's interesting is that in the United States, the congressional record suggests that the industry advocated for what largely exists in Canada now, which is this kind of peer, kind of voluntary regulatory setup, saying, "Hey, we'll regulate ourselves," and that at that time wasn't accepted, and in place put this kind of federal overlay. But the reality is that when you look past that, you really still are looking at a very much self-regulated system. In Canada and the United States, there is a tremendous amount of authority vested in these institutional bodies at the research facilities that are supposed to approve protocols and set standards and ensure compliance. And so in many ways, the United States often is also characterized as a rather decentralized system, even though on paper it appears to be centralized around this federal law. We would also say that, again, the inability of the government to stop research operations, or now to even financially penalize violations, has really rendered the law largely toothless. So it's on the books, but how much it actually impacts what's happening at the laboratory level really doesn't instill much confidence. The one tremendous benefit, I will say, is the reporting, the ability to get public records that are often filed by virtue of this law. So we will absolutely credit that and say that's tremendous for helping inform what we do know about the industry and where we lay our emphasis, and additionally what we can educate people around. So the law does require that these annual reports get filed, and even though it's only for a small sliver of the animals, it still at least represents some of those. Yes. Who we are working to help. And then also the inspection records, even if they don't result in any meaningful quote unquote enforcement, they do allow us to have additional insight into what's happening in some of these laboratories. And so we as advocates are grateful for that.
I agree. I agree. When I worked for an organization in the United States, we were able to look up some private laboratories, and any laboratories really, to see on some level what was going on. Amy or Lindsey, I'm going to get you guys to stop sharing screen if you don't mind, because I'll kind of reserve my own sort of Canadian interest here. We'll keep it to Ridglan. If somebody wants to chat, I mean, we do call this a town hall purposely, so we can see your voice or see your face and hear your voice, if that's something you want to do. If not, I will read from the chat. So Catherine,
can I add one thing too really quick?
Sure, yeah, of course.
Just to piggyback off what Lindsey was saying too, I think one thing that we didn't really hit on is even just, so Ridglan's a private entity, so it's actually really difficult to get records from them. And so actually one of, I think, kind of our bigger wins was getting the certificate of veterinary inspection records. So historically, we haven't really seen any other groups find those. And so we kind of put together a few pieces and realized that in Wisconsin, because dog sellers are required to submit those to the state, those are records we could get. That's actually the only way we were then able to put together the buyer's list. Okay. And so historically, that wasn't publicly available to anyone. And so being able to have those records, and not too far after, so in terms of, there had been other buyer's list that had been released, but that came from data that wasn't publicly available. And so I think putting that out there really did change the landscape in terms of who's buying from Ridglan, what does this ecosystem look like? And so I think there are records that we're grateful we can get. I think it's been a little tricky always knowing what those are. And so that's been something that I think we have been able to really partner together with, figuring out at the local level, what can we get and how can we use those records? So we do have, I would argue the regulations are woefully insufficient, but we have been able to get some public records too that have helped with that a little bit. So just a few more pieces.
Yeah, and I mean, in Canada, it's a speculation on our end, and most animal advocates and animal rights organizations in Canada do speculate that the majority of Canadian facilities are, of course, purchasing from Ridglan Farms. We just had an expose where that came out, and it's still a discussion, that even though the controversy and questioning of what was going on at Ridglan Farms was happening over the course of many years, this Canadian facility, members of the CCAC, a regulatory body, obviously supposedly being overseen by the Canadian Council on Animal Care, which states that you must buy from a reputable supplier. It was found out that over the years they've been purchasing from Ridglan. Now, of course, Canada does not have huge breeding colonies. I think I heard of one in the last decade. Whether that exists still or not, I am not sure. So we can only suspect that the Canadian laboratories and private facilities are purchasing from either Marshall Bioresources or Ridglan Farms. So, yeah.
Yeah. And now that we do have, I think even just the tattoo information too, now that that is more publicly available, it would be easier to track. And I think, Lindsey, we have records that would hopefully records request in that would hopefully track some of that information, right? We think we can get that. Yeah.
Okay, so Kathy, since you're on camera, do you want to talk? So Kathy, yeah, hi. Kathy's is an advisor pretty
Excellent.
much. Pretty
That's
much.
Simon. He was
runs the
born at
show.
Ridglan Farms.
Yeah, so this is a Ridglan Farms dog. So I'll read your questions, Kathy, unless you want to. Go for it.
I'm okay with it, but I said, so I want to know, I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to I want to know what it means that they gave up their breeding license versus it being taken away from them. Like, I worry that they're up to something by doing that. When I think about in Vigo, they were already in the court process, and I think they were like kind of, not a legal person, forced to give it up. So what does that mean?
Do you want to start, Lindsey?
If you'd like me to, otherwise you go for it, Amy.
Either's fine. I think so. Essentially, with them having to give up their license, this was an agreement they reached with the special prosecutor. I think one of the biggest disappointments is the delay. And so this decision was just reached in October, but it doesn't come into effect until July. And so I will say, having seen the agreement, it does look a little bit more like an honor system. I think that the agreement signed, I think that will hold up at the state level. And so that agreement would prevent them from selling dogs off-site to other facilities. And part of that is because the special prosecutor didn't have any ability to impact the side of their research operations. And so just because that's regulated at the federal level and not the state level. And so that's the part that gets, I think, even kind of more interesting too, is that they can continue to breed for dogs that stay on site. And so if the dogs are then classified under their research registration, they can still breed in-house. And that's actually how a lot of other places in the US kind of honestly, I think, go unnoticed, is because they're not selling dogs. And so they may be breeding in-house for research studies. So another place in Madison, LabCorp, we have a pretty big location here. They breed in-house for research studies, but they don't sell off-site. And so Ridglan is looking to adapt that model. But I do think one of the biggest disappointments is this delay where they can continue to sell until July, and then it would change. Do you have more, Kathy, and then I think Lindsey, if you want to add?
Okay, so they can still breed, but they can't sell. But so they basically could go from whatever you said with the R license, where they have like 80 something dogs right now, but they have the capacity for 3,200 dogs or whatever. And that could turn into all research at this point.
That's
hopefully
correct.
not. I mean, I live in Minnesota. Like, I'm ready to go ninja my way in. So, except I got to wait till my kid's an adult so I don't go to jail. All right, I can't go to jail when he's a kid. So.
The concerns you mentioned, that's exactly like, I think how they're planning to kind of reinvent themselves, if you will. I think one of the points I have hope for is I do think because the lead veterinarian, his veterinary license is under investigation now, I think that could change how they're able to operate in the future. But they do still have 2 other veterinarians that are also currently practicing and part of the management there. So I think there's still a lot of variables, but that is, unfortunately, I think they're looking to recreate themselves that way. Lindsey, what do you want to add?
I think that was a good answer.
Okay.
So one more part to this. I'm sorry, I know other people have questions, so I'm going to stop after this one, I promise. So is there going to be more work done on shutting down the research part of it? Or right now is the focus on the breeding and selling? I mean, I know it's a lot, and I know it's a long, slow process. I like.
Do you want to take that, Lindsey, or do you want me to?
I'm so sorry, you guys. There was a bit of a lag on my internet. I heard something about the research operation, but didn't hear most of Kathy's question.
I can take that one. Oh, go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, no, go ahead. Did you want to answer, Amy?
I can take a stab at it. So I think basically the question is kind of what are as we're kind of thinking through theories of change, is it possible to target more of the research side? And I think largely the part that's difficult is at the state level, they regulate the breeding side. And so when you look at the complaints that were filed at the state level, especially the petition for the special prosecutor, that only focused on the breeding operations because it's more regulated in many ways. I think the issue is when it's classified under research, there's more exemptions at play. It gets a little bit, or I would argue more, it's harder to enforce regulations just because there's so many exemptions that are in play for the research side. And so that's part of why the focus has been more on the breeding side of the operation. And actually that kind of goes back to where Ridglan has taken on their official legal position is that all the animals are research animals, was, I would argue, to kind of evade some of that accountability by trying to essentially, it's just not as regulated.
Got it.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
And sorry for the other people who have questions. Like I'll stop.
No,
These are good questions.
yeah, appreciate it. Thank you, Kathy. Tamara, thank you for coming. Please go ahead. Thanks so much.
One of the concerns that I have, and I'm wondering if Amy and Lindsey can shed some light on this, is Ridgeland. I mean, the stipulation between Ridgeland and the state of Wisconsin is that Ridgeland, the corporation Ridgeland, is avoiding any criminal liability by selling off these dogs. But it is entirely possible for Ridgeland, for the Ridgeland's 3 owners to actually sell Ridgeland, to sell it to some other purchaser who would then potentially be innocent of any criminal wrongdoing, and who can continue or who can resurrect the commercial breeding license. The commercial breeding license, in my understanding from the STIP, is that, that's only going to go away if Ridgeland continues to be the corporate entity selling the dogs. So I'm not sure how to foresee and forestall that kind of sale by the 3 owners. They could sell it to any of the Envigo guys who are still floating around. One of them is trying to open up a facility of 30,000 macaws in Bainbridge, Georgia. That doesn't seem to be going well for him. He could just step in with his millions and purchase what used to be Ridglan Farms. So I don't know. Has anyone any thoughts about this?
It's been discussed. Would Amy and Lindsey, we've probably discussed this all at length. The variety.
I haven't heard that discussion here tonight.
No, I'm sorry. And I don't mean that as if it's a private conversation. I mean, I think that it's exactly, I think what a lot of us are thinking. Would you guys agree that there is a possibility that there's so many ways out of this for them and so many loopholes? What do you guys think?
You can start, Lindsey.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are very, very real concerns and very real possibilities. And I think that this is part of the challenge, at least in the United States, when we talk about the corporate veil and different pieces around how these entities are allowed to incorporate and how they're often allowed to kind of shield accountability from individual actors. And so we're in a position where my understanding is, in this case, it was the entity, right? The entity, not individual actors within an entity. And so how much can you restrain the action of the individuals, right, behind this corporation? And I think that that's very possible. I don't know the realities around whether the special prosecutor could have put reasonably additional restrictions on the individuals, or in other ways curtailed what could be done. So I can't speak to that or render a critique there, but I think, Tamara, yeah, there's definitely the possibility for this to certainly it seems to rebrand or for ownership to change. And I think that goes back to the piece that we tried to hit on at the end, that
You're breaking up, Lindsay.
Buyers. Sorry, guys.
Can you repeat that last part a
I'm
little
back.
again?
Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry guys. I was to say, which is why I think we try to hit so clearly, or what we wanted to make clear kind of at the end, is that we need to have a global picture of this industry. When we talk about Ridglan Farms exists because there's demand. If that demand, even if Ridglan Farms ceases, no one buys it, they shut it down, no one sells it, but the industry wants dogs, someone else is going to step in and fill that gap. And so that's what is so important about us kind of looking at Ridglan. We're talking about advocacy. We're looking at this as a case study, but it can't be to the exclusion of broader advocacy around changing the entire paradigm that supports this industry. Because again, as long as demand exists, someone's going to supply it in this form or another.
If Ridglan
That's our
goes
view.
away, Marshall Bioresources wins the lottery, or vice versa, or any other innovative who we know is still operating and owned in Vigo wins the lottery, because there is demand. So that demand has to be shut down. And I think you make a good point, Lindsay, as well, because from an organization such as the Beagle Alliance, who really makes it our business to make collaboration a part of the way in which we work, to promote unity between rescues, between advocacy organizations. You said it perfectly, but in terms of what Ridglan is doing and in terms of what animal researchers and breeders are doing, is that there's different roles and there's different actors. And so in the same way that they have branched out and come together to create a supply and demand, we as advocates and rescues, for us, we can stand at Ridglan and say, hey, we'll take the dogs and, work with our rescue partners. We have to be larger than them. And we know that we do have the majority. If we could spread awareness enough so that the majority actually knew that animal testing is happening, that dogs were being used in testing, we would be able to each have our individual roles and mobilize globally to end this, because most people would be mortified that it still happens.
And I applaud that. I think that it really is an international problem, because if we sort of look at the best possible thing that one can hope for in the Trump administration, that's certainly not going to be a protection of endangered species, protection of habitat. The only place where there looks like we could push is this use of animals in medical experiments. And so if the FDA Modernization Acts continue to pass, and if animal experimentation becomes illegal, which I don't think it will, but perhaps within this administration, then what Marshall's will do with its 40,000 beagles is it will sell them internationally. I mean,
Agreed.
they have no reason to go away. They'll just the dogs will just travel further.
Mm-hmm. This is the drug trade.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is like, it really is. And it's almost as underground. It's very secretive. It's even more secretive in Canada. And, again, mass awareness has to happen, because we know that the majority of people disagree with the practice of use of animals in research. And even if they don't disagree, the only reason that they don't disagree is because they've been told inaccurate scientific facts, which allows them to believe that their grandmother or their child or whomever they love is going to be cured of cancer by the animal use model. And we already know that there is other ways of doing things that are less expensive and more effective and do not harm animals and also help humans. So again, this is a global societal issue, not an animal rights issue, really, when you look at it. We are all doing this for the love of animals, but this is a much, much greater and graver situation than simply narrowing it down to the animals. And I certainly don't mean that, because of course the animals, we're all here for the animals. So you guys all know how I'm saying that, but it's a big picture, which I know we're at 10 after 8 and we usually go about an hour. Does anyone else have any questions? Debbie, you have your hand up, but I'm not sure if that was a mistake, because I know you always type in the chat. So type in the chat, Debbie, if you want to talk. And I don't see any other hands up. I want to just ask something personal if you guys, oh, Ken, sorry. Oh, Ken, hey, Ken. Ken, do you want to, where are you? I've got, oh, there you are. Are you going to come on camera, or you're going to just ask the question?
Yeah, you can turn the camera on. I don't mind.
I think you have to do it. Whatever works for you. But I just saw your hand pop up, so go for it.
Sorry, it won't let me turn the camera on. I tried.
Oh, okay. No worries.
I need permission, or team need permission or something.
Really? No,
yeah.
we've got cameras on here, as you can see.
Maybe it's my settings in
Okay.
in itself. Teams is not allowed to use my camera. Oh,
Oh, okay.
Can change
Well,
my
we can hear
settings
you.
it's in my settings. I'm wondering, and I'll use the FDA as an example just to simplify it, because in Canada, food is regulated one way when it comes to testing on animals, and drugs are used under another act for testing on animals. But with the FDA, it's kind of all bunched in together. I'm just wondering, is there any statistics on what companies, what products are requiring these animal testing, particular to beagles? Maybe looking into that, finding out what these companies are, lobbying these companies, putting pressure on these companies. You know, any idea on how these dogs are being used and why in particular?
I can start this one if you want, Lindsay. And I think that kind of gets into the bigger picture too, in terms of, I would argue that the main reason dogs are still used in experimentation is the regulatory landscape. Because I think if you look at particularly, so the FDA regulates essentially all human products that enter the market, especially for consumption. The EPA, so the Environmental Protection Agency, they will regulate things more like chemicals or pesticides, things that we typically wouldn't ingest. And those aren't like perfectly separate delineations, but generally speaking, but in order for instance, for a pharmaceutical to reach market currently, in practice, the FDA does require first rodent testing, and then the FDA will require non-rodent testing. Typically, beagles are the species of choice that are used, and so that's where most of the dogs are used in experiments in the US. And that is all for preclinical testing before you get into clinical testing, where we actually move a product into actually studies to see if it's safe in humans. And I think this is all it's all just this regulatory framework where what we're trying to do in preclinical testing is make sure that a drug is safe and effective for human use. And so there's no reason we need to use animals for that. There's other methodologies we have. It's just currently in practice that for a drug to get approval, that's what the FDA has historically looked at. And so companies are motivated to essentially do what package the FDA has historically accepted. In April, they made the announcement that they're planning to create new practices, right? To say actually what is a kind of a package that can be put together to evaluate a drug that then the FDA can look at using non-animal methods. And so I think that's really going to be the pivotal point, is when they announce what this guidebook is for what specific studies are they looking at, what do they need to get a drug to market. I think that's when we're going to see the shift. So I'm really optimistic about that, and hope they are able to implement that soon. You want to add anything, Lindsay?
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, go ahead, Lindsay.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I second what Amy's saying in terms of the regulatory landscape. That's definitely a primary driver. And I would just not to be a broken record, but to reiterate that this is one of the reasons too that we need like systemic change, because if we're talking about regulations and the regulations require animal testing, then even if we're successful in having the use of dogs reduced, what we're talking about is shifting harm to another species, potentially. And so that's also, of course, of concern. So we're talking about hoping to change these regulations at a core level so that no animal, no dog, or anyone else is being subject to any of these tests. We are going to need, like Amy mentioned, of course, shifts there in what's required. And then, of course, prohibitions on what can be done, as Tamara mentioned earlier.
Yes, it would be, I mean, obviously, it is our belief that dogs will spark the change because that is the majority, of course, and that's something that we say all the time. However, certainly we don't want it to be at the cost of other animals, and we want to be advocating for animal-free science, period, because that's just moving the problem over, and that's not solving anything, obviously, right? Before we go, and I thank you guys and I thank you all for coming, but before we go, I want to make this a little personal, okay? Because I think that we all come to the table in whatever role we're at with the animals for a personal reason. Mine is the photo behind me. And, you know, that's the beagle that is not a former research beagle, but walked into my life, and I had no choice but to research what the heck I did with a beagle who was getting out of my yard every 15 seconds, and, you know, what to, and that's how I found out that beagles were the most used dog in testing, et cetera, et cetera. But what, I'll start with you, Amy. Why?
Yeah, so I think it's been really like how kind of my whole story's come together. So I was a kid that for years begged for a dog. I would be at friends' houses and like I just want to hang out with the dog, like was happy to see the friend, but was mostly there for the dog. So I begged and begged, and my parents finally were like, okay, fine, you can get a dog. So we went to the bookstore and we are like looking through the books, and I saw the page on beagles, and I was like, I want a beagle. And so, I mean, it was just like love at first sight, like saw the floppy ears. And so parents, you know, found a beagle for me. And so I was in first grade at the time, and then have had 3 beagles over the course of my life. So currently I have Maggie, who's just the sweetest pup ever. But I mean, I had one beagle got hooked. And then when I found out this was happening, I mean, literally just 30 minutes from where I was living. And actually where I grew up was, I mean, just 15 minutes from Ridglan, like super close to, I had no idea. So I think in seeing that, I mean, I first heard about the news and I was just a mess. I mean, I cried and cried for the first couple of weeks and was just really grateful to have found others right away. But I mean, I remember reading the news story with like Maggie sitting next to me and just thinking this could be her. Like there's, you know, these dogs are, you know, there's no reason that she should be different than these pups that are there. So my 3 beagles are definitely the reason that I got involved in care, and just have been so grateful to like find my beagle people. I think we're distinct. I think it's like, you know, there's all types of dogs and animals, but the beagle folks get me in terms of, you know, I'm at the park every weekend with her for hours on end, and I think, you know, everybody here has probably a connection to a beagle, and so yeah, so I'm a total beagle person.
They all need to be committed is pretty much it. Okay.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I'll be honest, I'm so impressed. Mine has been quiet this whole time. I'm trying not to like give her too much attention, because normally this time of day, yeah, like she's everywhere, and we usually shut the dog park down every night. So usually I've got my headlamp on and someone's asking, you know, why she's still barking, and yeah, anyway, sorry, Lindsey, all yours.
Absolutely. Yeah. Lindsey, what about you?
Yes, I have not had the privilege of having a beagle in my family, though I did have the privilege of growing up with dogs. I came to this slightly differently. I was interested and worked in the field of human social justice issues, and recognized, thanks to the work of others, that the treatment of non-human animals is not typically considered among social justice issues, but it needs to be. And so started working to advocate for the rights of those who aren't of our species, and was lucky enough to find myself here advocating against animal research. This to me is particularly interesting. I come to this as an ethical vegan who attempts my best to not cause harm to others of my own species or others, best of my ability. What I think is challenging in this space, and that sets it somewhat apart in my mind as opposed to other areas where we are in areas we often, not always, but often have the choice to use our dollars to support more ethical options. We can say, I don't want to buy this, or I'm not going to buy this, or I'm going to, eat this, or I'm not going to, etc. When it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, when it comes to the industry of science, we are complicit by virtue of the regulations that our country has put in place and by the use of our tax dollars. And then on the private market, we don't have the option to say, but I don't want to cause harm in this way. I want to opt out of this. And so to me, this is such an important issue for so many reasons, but also because we as consumers, and to the point of the question that Vina put in the chat, there's limited amounts that we as individuals can do to opt out of the system and to force change. That's what we're doing here tonight. And that's one of the reasons I'm so grateful that we're all here. And Lori, that you brought us together and that you let us be a part of it.
Well, thank you. And we all have our roles, and I'm blessed to have recently met both of you guys, and Amy and I got a chance to meet in person when we were doing our London rescue tour. And I think collaboration is the way to go. And Vina and Thea, who ask what can we do to help, which I am going to shout out alongside of Kathy, is that they were part of our London tour, Amy, with the 10 dogs. They are the Minnesota girls that we stay at when we have the dogs. So they're asking what we can do to help. And I think that the answer really, and Lindsey, chime in as well, you guys, if you want to chime in. I think we lost Amy there, but really at this point, it really is spreading awareness, letting other people know, sharing posts. I mean, social media is powerful. That's how a lot of people find out. And speaking to for us, it's our members of parliament in Canada. Who do you speak to, Lindsey, in the States? Do you reach out to your state officials? I imagine, who's the first level of contact for you in each state?
Yes, so you can speak to your state representatives or state senators. You also can, of course, go to the federal level, but we have seen folks also work with some of their local officials. So at the county level, for instance, to talk about if there's policies that can be implemented to reduce or prohibit this practice. And I agree with you, Lori. A huge component of this, and part of why I'm so excited to be here tonight, is that I think the discussion is critical. Us understanding what's happening, us discussing what can be done and what we want to happen, and then trying to charter a course together to get that done, I think is so critical. And so I thank you for this forum, and I think you're absolutely right to say everybody can take an action, and together we can help move toward a world where this is not happening.
Agreed. So well said. We will leave it at that. And of course, we will keep you all up to date through sharing posts and however way we can do it in terms of the work that Amy and Lindsey are doing, that the Marty Project and Rise for Animals are doing, and the Beagle Alliance and our partners, Kindness Ranch and Keeper and Kin Chelsea, have been able to chat about what's going on at Ridglan and sort of steady ourselves in case we do at some point see the release of those animals. We want to be ready. That's why we're here, is to not only advocate for animal-free science, but to, at the very least, offer dogs that have been in research a real good last years of their lives. And we've proven that it can be done. So I'm going to just ask, I'm going to do a little pitch here, because this is part of my job, running a charity, of course, is that I'm going to thank you all. I'm going to absolutely shamelessly remind you that Giving Tuesday is coming up on December 2nd. We would love for you to support us. We are blessed to have both a Canadian and a US platform, so that each country supporters can receive tax receipts. If that doesn't work for you, please think about donating to your favorite rescue or your favorite nonprofit on Giving Tuesday. It really makes the difference for a lot of charities and nonprofits going forward into 2026. So again, I love you guys for coming here, and Amy and Lindsey, honestly cannot thank you enough for tonight and beyond for all your work. And of course, we'll talk soon. And everybody else, and of course, you guys too, have a blessed holiday season. We don't do a town hall in December because we know how everyone's crazy busy. So we will see you back in January. We have some pretty cool town halls coming up. So we'll see you guys then. And thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Take care. Bye, guys. Thank you.